Judith, and welcome everyone today to our webinar on maximizing leadership. I think we have a nice itinerary that will touch on a number of things and lots of time for discussion. So please keep the questions coming. And I will start by introducing you to our two absolutely fabulous panelists. I'll start with Chio Ishikawa from the Seattle Art Museum. Chio's the Susan Brotman Deputy Director for Art and Curator of European Painting and Sculpture. And Chio works with the Director of SAM, Kimberly Rorschach, to plan SAM's artistic program, overseeing the Curatorial, Conservation, and Museum Services Division. So quite a large portfolio, I would say. Chio's been at SAM since 1990 and was at various large institutions before then. Chio's expertise is in historical, sometimes Netherlandish Spanish art. She's curated Spain in the Age of Exploration, 1492 to 1819, for which the work she did was awarded, well, she was awarded the Spanish Award of Isabel La Católica in 2004. Quite a distinguished prize. And since then, there have been a plethora of other projects, including the recent traveling, she was the local curator for the recently traveling Picasso masterpieces from the Musée National Picasso, and the list goes on. And joining Chio in discussion is Barry Lord, who we know as the co-founder and co-president of Lord Cultural Resources and the internationally recognized, one of the internationally recognized world's leading museum planners. But I invited Barry to join us today because his career actually started as a curator both of art and history. Of course, Barry and Gail Lord have started museums or built museums and planned them from ground up and every stage in between. They're also the authors of the museum planning manuals that are used prolifically in museum studies courses around the world. And most recently, Gail and Barry co-wrote a book called Artists, Patrons, and the Public, Why Culture Changes. And this year, Barry has added to his list of achievements the book Art and Energy, which he wrote and is a really interesting new look at how energy, a timely topic, relates to art and how it might connect our audiences to our collections today. So we'll start actually with Chio and then Barry giving us some of their own thoughts on what maximizing leadership and curatorial leadership means to them and more broadly, and then we'll open it up to questions. So start thinking what those might be. Chio, thanks.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. And I was thrilled but also kind of perplexed when I was invited to participate in this webinar. But I had just participated as an audience member and found it so helpful. And it's very useful to think about a topic like this, in addition to the kind of day-to-day tasks that occupy a lot of our time in museums. So for my opening remarks, I'm just going to start with my own history, and I know that we're going to get into broader issues as we go on. So as Sasha said, I've been at SAM since 1990. It was my first curatorial position after I'd had wonderful internships at the MFA Boston and the Metropolitan Museum. And I think in many ways my path to the deputy director role within my institution is a very classic scenario. I started as an assistant curator here. I was actually part-time to begin with, and then I was promoted to full curator, and then 2 different times I served as acting deputy director as the deputy director would leave. I kind of became the number 2 or the well, anyway, and then finally I was officially made the deputy director in 2005. Now, that looks as though it's a very intentional path, but it wasn't. My primary ambition when I got into museum work was a selfish one. I wanted to work with objects, and The idea of leadership seemed very threatening to me. I felt like I just want to do my work. I just want to focus on my field. And, over time, of course, and probably with my first exhibition, I discovered the satisfaction of looking outward a little bit more, sharing with an audience, a shift to thinking not just of the peers in my field, but of a broader audience that could experience and learn to love art as much as I did. But I do think, this idea, I think a lot of people, and I certainly had this every time that they asked me to serve as acting deputy director, I had this kind of lingering sense that I'm not really worthy for that responsibility. I think you've made a mistake. I think that that's kind of a common thing, particularly maybe among women in professional life. It was my first reaction when I got this invitation, I have to be honest and say. But I think that that insecurity is very self-involved. And one of the things that I have learned over the years is that, and that as I fought down those feelings of unworthiness and insecurity, because I also have a very strong sense of duty and I have a very strong desire to learn. So now I recognize that might be a first kind of emotional reaction, but if I can get over myself, I have almost uniformly, or every time I've taken on an assignment that seemed a little frightening to me, it's been a good experience. It's been broadening. I've learned a lot, and I've actually had fun. And the other thing is, I think that one of the things that happens as you accumulate titles or accumulate prestige within your institution is that people look at you differently. But one of the things I'm very mindful of as I work very closely with our curatorial team is that there's so many kinds of leadership. It doesn't have to reside at the top of the institution. And as you think about mentoring junior colleagues, I think that's something that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So why was I tapped for a bigger role at SAM among my peers here? And at the first time I was asked to be the acting deputy director, I was the youngest and most junior staff member. And so it wasn't an entirely popular decision among my peers, I think. But I know that one reason was I had worked at major institutions before, and in the early 90s we were still a pretty insular place. A lot of people had only worked at SAM and had started there. And so it was bringing, I knew that, or I was told I had another perspective. And another thing is, I think that perhaps more than some of my other colleagues, I thought institutionally. And this despite the fact that, as I said, I came in with a kind of selfish, I just want to enjoy my work. I want to be able to study these objects and be with the objects and be with artists. But as I worked at SAM, I certainly felt ownership about the projects that I developed, but I also saw the benefits of sharing them and sharing the responsibility for the success of these projects if I collaborated more with my colleagues. And I still know colleagues, curatorial colleagues in many institutions who are very protective of the projects that they've nurtured so carefully and many times for years. So they figured out all of the educational programs that need to take place around this. They know what the layout should be, and they don't really invite anybody else in. And that, I think, is problematic at a time when museums are so extremely audience-centered as never before. So I think a collaborative perspective is one thing that helped me move to the next level. Not everybody wants to be chief curator or deputy director, and there are definite drawbacks. Some of you, I'm sure, know this. One is time. As Sasha said, I oversee curatorial, and as of the last year and a half, I oversee conservation and the registrars and exhibition design. And the only reason I can do that is because those departments have excellent managers. And so the best thing about it is that it's brought us together more. We don't feel so polarized, as in the curators are making us do this. Everybody understands a little bit better now how we're all part of a holistic program. But one of the issues in terms of the time that the administrative position takes is I still hold the title of Curator of European Painting and Sculpture, and it is painful to me how little I've been able to do for my department and my collection in recent years. And when I'm the local curator for an exhibition, and note, local curator, I haven't been able to organize an exhibition ever since I took this position, I squeeze those duties in between meetings, institutional writing, assignments, presentations, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is, another drawback, I think, or challenge, is that when you're in a role like this, you know too much. It's wonderful and valuable to have a deeper understanding of how an institution works, how the board thinks, how donors think, what the key issues are for the administration, how the budget is put together, all of those things. But it's a challenge not to let that knowledge kind of hinder creative thinking or make you write off ideas before they even get expressed because you know all the reasons why it shouldn't work. And then going along with that is that we become so focused on logistics that it's sometimes you have to actively work to get yourself back to the ideas that put us here in the first place. So that's all I'll say for now. I know Barry will have comments that broaden out beyond a personal example like this, and then I'll be back for questions.
Sheol, have you know that when we were brainstorming panelists for this session, your name came up several times from across the country. So that it's funny that, you know, I would never imagine that insecurity exists. Barry, thanks.
I've beaten it down, but it's just an automatic response, I think. Anyway.
For sure. Well, thanks for being here. Barry, thanks for joining us.
Well, delighted to be here this afternoon, and always great to be able to get into a conversation with a group of curators. On the subject of leadership, of course, the standard bromides are management is doing the thing right, whereas leadership is doing the right thing. And like all cliches, there's a certain truth to that, certainly. And then, of course, the question becomes, how do we determine what's the right thing? It reminds me that when I was a curator, years before, I was about 20 years in the field before we founded Lord Cultural Resources and went to the planning level. But when I was a curator, I used to have a little card on my desk that was printed and asked simply, is this exhibition necessary? And I found that very helpful to remind me to ask myself that, you know, is what I'm doing really necessary? Does it really matter? And if so, why? Which is to say, one needs to ask, why is this the right thing to do? If this is what, as a leader, I am trying to communicate, I need to know not only that it is the right thing, but also why is it the right thing to do? Not just for your museum, and certainly not just for your career, but for the community. Of course, your visitors, but also your non-visitors, your community in the broadest sense, and your community of scholars more broadly, and ultimately for the world. Why is it the right thing to do? What is the real underlying meaning of what it is we're about? So that really brings me to point one. I've got a simple little 3 points, I think, that can be remembered. One is inspiration. The leader can inspire by her or his fidelity to mission. And I want to say fidelity to your mission, to the curator's mission, which is not necessarily the same as the institutional mission, but must be related to it. Both things are important. That is to say, the curator must have a grasp of why what they're doing really matters, to the world and most broadly, and specifically to their community, and specifically to their institution or their discipline and so on, and at the same time must relate that to the mission of the institution itself, and really must be secure about that relationship, and then communicate that to everyone else they're working with. So I think that's the first of 3 points about how leadership really can function for curators: fidelity to the mission in all those senses. Then the second level is really fidelity to yourself. The position of the curator has been certainly imperiled at various times, and still is in various places. We've certainly seen that. Our company now has been 33 years, and even prior to that, in the previous 20 years, there's been a great deal of difficulty around curatorship in some places, as exhibitions became a team effort, as the importance of interpretive planning, and of course exhibition design, and many other factors, marketing and so on and so forth, came to be more and more important. The role of the curator was debatable, and in some cases was not well resolved. We've had situations where we were actually asked to help plan an exhibition for an institution that had a curator who was an absolute expert in that field. And when I said, well, yes, but surely you don't need us since you have him. But then I was told, oh no, he is very busy writing a book about something totally different. He will have nothing to do with this project. We want you to do it. Didn't work out for various reasons. We decided not to go ahead with that, partly because we didn't really like that relationship very much. But it does show you that you can have that kind of complete, separation between the curator's role and the others. But it is really important to keep, yes, certainly to be a team player, but to keep fidelity to yourself, to your own discipline, to your own expertise. We've made this point first. I just show these couple of texts. The Manual Museum Management that Sasha mentioned was a place where we first showed that, and then particularly in the more recent book, the Manual of Strategic Planning for Museums. And Diane DeGrazia, who's a very well-known curator, I'm sure known to many of you, a senior curator who was with the National Gallery, and prior to that with Cleveland Museum of Art and Indianapolis. Diane wrote a very nice case study for us entitled "Engaging Curators in the Strategic Planning Process" in this book on the Manual of Strategic Planning for Museums. In that, she makes the point about the real centrality of the curator in the strategic planning process in the museum as a whole, how important it is that the curator take a positive role, and she suggested in relation to collection planning, of course, and all the implications of collection planning. She suggested in relation to exhibition planning, of course, planning public programs, and she suggested in relation to publications planning. These are areas where it's really critical that the curator take a positive role. And as she points out, and certainly it's been our experience too, that quite often curators can be resistant to that and say, oh no, again, I just want to do my work. I don't want to get involved with these bigger issues of planning. But in fact, it is only through that kind of engagement in planning that curators can really take hold. One of our recommendations in both those books and in our practice is for research planning. And this, I find, frightens a lot of curators, but I think is extremely important to see the possibility of actually planning your personal research in relation to your institution's research priorities and so on, and then having that as something you can stick to, which prevents the phenomenon which we see too often, where curators are suddenly told, "Oh, stop what you're doing. We have to do an exhibition on this, and just change your priorities for the next 6 months or the next 2 years or whatever. You're going to be working on that instead of what you thought you were going to be working on." And that, of course, produces a sense of helplessness on the part of the curator, and indeed is not usually good for the institution either, even if the director thinks he or she is doing the right thing. So how to prevent that? I think it is through systematic planning of research, so that you plan over the next 3 years, I'm going to be doing this, it's going to culminate in this publication and this exhibition, and so on. And then if someone comes along and says, in a position of authority, and says, oh no, we want you to stop that and do this instead because of some short-term priority of the institution, at least one can say, well, wait a minute, we have a research plan. You know, the institution as a whole has its plan. I'm part of it. My research is supposed to be delivering this thing in 3 years. I'm not going to be able to do that if I follow your direction and change my priorities. So, I mean, at least it gets discussed if it doesn't get changed, but hopefully it does give pause to all concerned. So fidelity to yourself, to your own, to what you have to contribute is a really important part, a second important part of leadership. And then the third, really it's a question of keeping collections and scholarship central to the institution, which it can easily get adrift from that. So the curator's role in providing leadership is really to keep collections and scholarship central by maintaining that kind of fidelity to themselves. And then finally, of course, is a question of fidelity to others, your relationship with others. And on that, I have to really admire my wife's example on that, because she is so outstanding in that. I see that all the time, even more than myself. But she and I both try to follow the principle of really showing everyone, particularly younger staff and less experienced staff, to show them that you believe in their best possibilities. And Gail really, I think, radiates this more so than I managed to, which is to say that you are entrusting them with what it is they have to do. And that means really, in a sense, turning your back on that particular area of the work for at least the allotted time in which you've given them to do this. Communicating, you can do this, is really important. That, yes, we believe that you can do this. And then turning your back so you allow them to make mistakes, to pull it all together. I actually discourage juniors from coming back to me with little memos and so on and so forth. I say, no, you figure it out to the best of your ability. I know you can do it. Let's see what you come up with, right? And then, of course, you do have to make sure you allow the time so that you can, fix problems if problems result, particularly if these people are working with other staff or working with clients or whatever, and therefore, leading to further problems. It's important to make sure you allow yourself the ability to make sure you can set things right if people don't live up to their greatest possibilities. But communicating that you expect their greatest possibilities to be realized is really the most important thing there. So basically, I think fidelity to a mission in that complex sense, fidelity to yourself, and fidelity to your faith in others, communicating that faith in others, you can do this, is, I think, to me, are really the three ingredients of a successful leadership.
Thanks, Barry. So I wanted to just take a second and bridge us into the question period by raising something that's often on my mind, and an issue that we're sort of grappling with here at the AGO on and off, and that I know resonates with colleagues when we meet annually for the AAMC conference. And that is this kind of tension between expertise and leadership, and how the two relate to one another. And I think Barry's emphasis on fidelity to oneself and specialization speaks to the training that we have for years and years through graduate school. And Chio, your CV speaks to the fact that you were at the top of your field when you made the transition into leadership. And then the tension manifests itself through your inability to engage in that field beyond that point. And I think I see, when I look across museum leader profiles that indeed most leaders are at the top of their field when they do make that shift. So there must be some relationship between these two things. And I wonder if the two of you could comment briefly on that relationship, whether they're mutually exclusive, whether they inform each other in some way, or whether it's far more nuanced than that and should be seen as a case-by-case status.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is a central tension in museum work, the tension between the institution and then, you know, the whole reason you're hired is because of your expertise, and so, you know, you don't want to negate that or ignore it. I mean, that's so frequently the case of, you know, people in academia. I think when they become chairman of departments or something like that, it's a whole new body of work that you weren't trained to do. That's when you went through and got your PhD. You weren't studying all of the things that you end up doing in daily life in museum administration, and that's why the Center for Curatorial Leadership was so extremely helpful to me. But I do want to say that I think that, to Barry's point about fidelity to yourself, often, of course, the curator's best work comes from the depth of their knowledge and the kind of ethical approach that they bring to their work. And so, you know, when I'm the kind of oversight for our curatorial team, part of me wants to encourage that single-mindedness, because it's really that depth and that, you know, following ideas down, that's where the lasting contributions come. That's where the new scholarship and ideas come from, and it's very important. But, you know, in a public-facing institution, you have to make sure that it has the follow-through in terms of reaching the public and in a, you know, in a digestible way or in an accessible way, let's say. But I wanted to mention a colleague who I so greatly admire here on our staff, Pam McCluskey, who has been our longtime curator of African art. And she is somebody who has never held a position of, you know, a title beyond curator of African art. But in many ways, she has been an incredibly important leader within our institution and within the field, I think. The way that she has done it in her long career is pushing the institution from the chosen position of outsider. And she, you know, her field is African art. She kind of feels like an underdog in our range of departments. We don't think of her that way, but I think it's a useful position because she agitates. She's the fly in the ointment. She challenges our traditional ways of doing things. For example, in the early 90s, she's one of the first people I know who brought in a whole team of African advisors and gave up her voice, gave up her authority because she wanted their voices to speak for the works in our collection. She also was one of the first people I know to kind of crowdsource an acquisition, and she did it in a very intelligent and educational way by keeping a group of pre-selected objects on view for a year and telling something about them, and then inviting comments and votes. And this was before you could do it using electronic media. There was a comment book in the gallery, and people would sit down and write, and we have all of that information. And the installation stayed on view for a year, and it had the additional educational benefit of showcasing a range of works and issues in African art, and in kind of exposing our collecting priorities and how we made selections about the collection. So arguably, this kind of curator can move the institution forward most effectively by not moving up the ladder. I know a wonderful curator, a really inspiring curator, who worked best from a kind of outside or, you know, underdog position, but when he became chief curator, it was a terrible thing for him. He was so conflicted when he now had to be the voice of the institution after an entire career of being a little outsider, kind of agitator. So, but I think that there are many kinds of leadership, and That to me, I mean, I feel that Pam has been a really important person in shaping an institutional identity for us just because of her creative and exciting and successful approach to her work.
Thanks.
Right. I think the question is a good one, and I think the solution is it does revolve around this question of fidelity to yourself, understanding that you are more than your expertise. You have a much richer existence in the world. You are part of a community, and therefore, to be faithful to yourself is a question of being faithful to some person who is bigger than your expertise. Certainly to honor your expertise and apply it and make it very much present, but on the other hand, to be a full citizen, if you like, of the world in what you're doing. So it is important. I think that's where expertise and leadership come together in that way. Expertise is a part of it, but it's a broader issue. Chio mentions co-curating, and of course, community curating or crowd curating, as some people want to call it. Participation in the curatorial process is, I think, something that is critically important to understand how it is possible to still exercise your expertise. We have, of course, great examples of visible storage. I was delighted to be in San Antonio a few weeks ago and see a visible storage gallery that we had planned for them, and they managed to do, and it was a fine example of the curatorial expertise being presented in a new way from what they had been used to, which were always thematic exhibitions. Here they were learning how to present that curatorial expertise through visible storage exhibitions. But how to present that curatorial expertise in the context of participatory museum, I think the National Museum of the American Indian provided a really strong example of that. They had a lot of struggle with it when they first started with the new building. They were consulting with First Nations groups all throughout both the whole of the Americas, North and South America, and of course they found real issues in how to merge their expertise with the contribution of the people participating in it. In all that, I just want to mention one word that is really critically important, and that is transparency. The whole question of making sure that as a curator, the leadership you're giving is transparent to everybody else who's involved in the activity, whether it's an exhibition or a publication or whatever. And also that it becomes transparent to your audience, and especially whenever any kind of meaningful participation is involved, it is so critically important that one thinks from the beginning in how to make this transparent. It's very important that we don't take the approach of saying, well, our expertise is such that we're going to do all this behind the scenes, and then, surprise, here's what it's all about, here's what it all means. No, there must be a transparency about the way in which we exercise our expertise, whether we're working with a group or through visible storage or whatever other media we're using. The multiple platform museum is very much upon us, which is to say, where we have a good idea for, say, an exhibition, then it's also a good idea, quite possibly, for a video game or for all kinds of other media through which one can communicate, that whatever that exhibition is about. So the multiple platform means that there are many different ways in which your expertise will be at service to the institution and to the people who eventually are going to be enjoying the exhibition or seeing the acquisitions or whatever. So it is really important to be able to, as it were, speak all those languages of the multiple platforms.
So one question that occurs to me is we're talking a lot about a curator having a voice and a curator being part of the process and sort of being directional and open. And I think something I hear a lot, especially with junior colleagues, is that they don't know how to be part of that conversation, sort of how to gain entry into that conversation. Is there some advice you have in terms of building oneself a small platform on which there's some visibility for more junior or not curators who would like to have that kind of profile that allows them to show leadership what it is that they are doing?
Well, I have an example from many, many years ago when I was an intern in the paintings department at the MFA in Boston. You know, at that time in particular, it was such a hierarchical organization that and there was this kind of despair for junior people ever to move forward or to be seen by the institution. So they formed, and it was a big enough institution that they could do this, formed a group of assistant curators, curatorial assistants, and interns, and they would meet on a monthly basis, have lunch together, and people would take turns presenting their work. And that was a very jealously guarded group. It became kind of your colleagues and your peers within the institution. And so that was the kind of thing that was very effective, I thought, in a very large institution. Here, when we bring on new curators, we try to have another curator be a mentor for them and kind of help them, you know, not only learn the procedures of the institution, but also have coffee with them, and so they can bounce off ideas and think about, you know, how they're going to make themselves you know, develop their programs and become part of the overall program. And then I meet with them on a fairly regular basis too. So we're also, you know, we're a smaller institution, so they have access to the board probably more than in some other institutions through our collections committee meetings and through other avenues. So I think they become part of the fabric of the institution in a pretty quick way.
That's interesting because it does put some of the onus on the institution to clear up those channels so that the dialogue is open.
Yeah, we want everybody to be successful. So we don't want to bring somebody on only to let them flounder or feel, you know, why did I come here? We want them to love it here and enjoy working with us. And we also work collaboratively quite a bit between the curators. So we have potlucks and things. I mean, we just tried to create a familial kind of atmosphere.
If you're fortunate enough to be in an institution where good leadership is being exercised, then, as I said, the good leader will be a person who puts confidence in younger and less experienced people and gives them a chance to, you know, do their thing and provides them with that platform. If unfortunately you find yourself in a situation where that isn't the case, then of course it's much more difficult to do that. And really, I think the best thing that you can do in that situation is to carve out a certain area where hopefully where you can get agreement with whoever your superior officer is before meetings are held or whatever, where you can say, okay, I'll cover this corner, okay, you know, that'll be my area to speak to. And then, of course, if one, in covering that corner, if one shows that one has a broader concept, and especially these three things, if one does have a sense of why it's necessary, why it's valuable, why it's important, and you show that in what you're doing in your own little corner, then I think people, even in the most difficult situation, will respond to that and say, hey, this is someone who's got a bigger and broader concept. But anyway, easy to say and not easy to do in some institutional situations. I'm not Seattle. I can see it sounds very good, but some of the people listening in may not be in such enlightened situations.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I know we do have many curators, young and mid-career and so on, who are actually very interested in leadership opportunities such as the one that you hold, Chio. And so I wondered, as a mentor yourself, would you recommend outside courses to build skills outside of actual curatorial work, such as fundraising, etc. And of course, that could include the Center for Curatorial Leadership, but it could also include, for example, a colleague of mine is doing community college courses in non-for-profit fundraising and management, which he finds very useful. Is this something that you would encourage?
I think it's beneficial, professional development, and it is something. I mean, I think you can't get it all from yourself, because especially if you haven't been exposed to it. And you know, a good part of what I did in the early years was just kind of watching what my predecessor had done and try to act like I knew what I was doing. So I think it's very helpful to learn best practices, and that was one of the things that was so great about the CCL. Another huge benefit of that experience, as probably as helpful as the business courses, was being part of a group and sharing some of our experiences and feeling that we could, you know, there was this atmosphere of trust that we could share our experiences and our concerns and doubts and all of those things. So I think for anything, being part of a community is such a powerful benefit. You contribute and you get something out of it. But certainly, you know, learning more about budgets and that there are different ways that you can build a budget, that's very important. The more information you have, the more powerful you are. So in terms of having arguments and you know, questioning that isn't naive the way I was so naive when I started out. You just are much more informed, and you'll be taken more seriously by you know, the administration or whoever, if you have knowledge. So I think it's a good thing.
I think certainly, especially understanding the budgeting process and what's involved is, you know, critically important, and I think the more you know about that, the better. As for fundraising, I would just caution, I think, yes, understanding how it works and so on is good, but don't try to do it on your own. And don't try to provide leadership in a field which is not yours, where, you know, there really are different rules of the game that you may be violating when you you know, when you step into it, and you may in fact think you're doing very well, getting what is really from a fundraising point of view, not a very big contribution, although you think it's great. You got $100,000 out of somebody, but in fact, if that person was really worth several million, then you may have really soiled the copybook. So it's not. It's important to understand it and to know more about it, but not to do the other. I would say this is even the case. You know, now the closest I think you have between curators and fundraising are these new committees that Tate and the British Museum have, and undoubtedly in some American museums as well, where a committee is set up for, say, Middle Eastern art or something, and there is one of those in Tate and one in British Museum, and the curator's role is to bring a possible acquisition to that committee. The committee is deliberately chosen as people who are capable of making those kind of donations. And basically, the text of the meeting, the agenda of the meeting, is the curator describing why this piece is important, why it should be a part of the collection, and so on, and then turning it over to the people on the committee to respond one way or the other, if whether they, you know, feel motivated to raise the money among themselves or make a single donation or whatever is required. Now, even in that situation, I think it's very important that the curator not try to anticipate the fundraising side of it, but rather simply be there to provide the expertise and leave it to others to direct the actual funding process itself.
Well, it's interesting. I hear three things have really resonated with me in this conversation, and they all have to do with alignment. So Chio and Barry, you've both said on separate occasions that an institution has to be transparent, has to demonstrate fidelity to its mission and purpose, and has to show commitment to community, both inside and out. And then when we've described what makes a great curator, those same words pop up. So transparency about what you're doing so people know what you're doing, fidelity to your specialization and expertise, and development of a community inside for support and connection with the community outside. So really what I'm hearing here is that regardless of your level, whether it be assistant curator, curatorial assistant, which I think we're also letting into the AMC membership now, there should be a general awareness of what the museum's where the museum stands on those three issues, and an effort to align your own work, however specific it may be in the research that you're doing or the donors that you're dealing with, to the to the mission of the institution, and always kind of being able then to have a common language with those working at the upper levels who are thinking about those things but in a broader context. And I can assure you that that's not something my PhD advisor was talking to me about when we were reading drafts of the dissertation. So that's, I think, a really interesting takeaway for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess lastly, I wanted to ask your thoughts. And I know we have some participants today who were in this, who participated in the Center for Curatorial Leadership. It's been around for several years now, but I want to know, Barry, maybe first your thoughts on how that's changed the field and museums and how they operate, and maybe Chio, a little bit about your experience and how that upped the ante for you.
Well, I think the existence of such a center and some other parallel programs elsewhere does show a much sharper awareness now than ever before that these skills which are involved with senior leadership and management of museums really go beyond the expertise of curators and others, of educators and so on and so forth in the field. That there's there's something else here, which is of course this whole field of management and so on that we've been deeply involved with for the last 30 years, seeing it develop very, very much. However, I think it's unfortunate if that is read as a prescription for understanding curatorship as merely training for a director. I think it's really important that that's really not a correct understanding of what a museum is in the first place, let alone what a curator is and what the role that's needed. The importance of the curator, as I said, is absolutely critical to keeping the museum on its focus of collections and scholarship, and without keeping that focus, the museum is really in peril. And believe me, we deal with them all the time. We are constantly going into situations where that centrality has been lost and needs to be restored. So I think it's important that we don't think that somehow or other it's about training to become a director or a deputy director or something, but rather that it's really important training to be the best possible curator one can be.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to CCL, it was the first year that they were not focusing just on becoming a director. I think there was one person in our group of maybe 12 who really had that ambition. Everybody else didn't particularly want to be a director. They wanted to be better at what they were doing. And most of us, I think, were heads of departments or heads of, chief curators or something like that. And that was a very liberating thing for me, because I do think, as I kind of said before, I think that the skills that you need to be a director, or the interests that you have, if you're a director, of course, it's helpful to come from curatorial, but it's a very different job. It's a very different job. And I personally am not the least bit interested in it. So I think I agree with you, Barry, about we have to be careful that the perception is if you don't have that on your resume, then you're less desirable than somebody else. I mean, I think it was incredibly valuable for me, really so amazingly wonderful to experience in that holistic way that you're talking about, both my professional skills, but also personally, I really found it valuable. But I think it's we have to be careful not to have just assent be the only measure of success. And to me, a big question is for somebody who has been of long service to an institution, doing creative work, pushing the institution forward, it's just frustrating to me that there's not a salary incentive, because their job isn't changing. There should be some other thing besides a promotion to do administrative work to reward that good work and recognize that good work. So anyway, going back to my point that there's all kinds of leadership, there's all kinds of success, and I think museums increasingly tend to measure things in a kind of business way or a corporate way, and I think that's something that has to be tempered with a recognition of why museums are the places that we love in the first place. It's because we have a different approach and a different set of skills.
Well, thanks so much, Gio, and thanks, Barry. Unless you guys have some parting words of advice for our mentors, I think it's a great moment to call it a day, and thanks to our mentors for attending. And I've definitely learned a lot, and I really enjoyed to be part of this discussion with you both. So have a great afternoon, everyone, and good luck, mentors, with the work you have to do in the months to come.
Thank you.